nobody wants to talk about mental health at work, right? And I
Mm-hmm.
just finally looked at her and just said, I have anxiety. And it was so great because
Mm-hmm.
I was role modeling,
Yep.
as a
Yep.
well-being
Yeah.
expert. And
Yeah,
here I
exactly.
am as a coach. I spent thousands of sessions with folks openly talking about their struggles in not necessarily mental health because I'm not a counselor, but around struggles and
Mm-hmm.
obstacles and everything. And I opened my mouth, especially that I have anxiety. And I was like, wow, I just said it out loud. Like, it's very different to talk about it with your partner or your therapist, but it's very different to talk about it
Mm-hmm.
to your director. But then I said to her, I'm taking care of it. I'm working on it. And she gets good. And that was it.
Welcome back to the Thriving Lawyers Podcast. In this week's episode, join Michael Kahn for an informative and lively interview with Katherine Adamenko, the manager of well-being for Ropes and Gray, an international law firm with 1,400 lawyers.
Welcome back to the Thriving Lawyers Podcasts. This is Michael Kahn. I am one half of Real-Time Creative Learning Experiences, Chris Osborne, who is a practicing lawyer, is the other half. I am a former lawyer and a licensed professional counselor and LAP counselor as well, Lawyer Assistance Program counselor. So today we have a wonderful person and also aside from being a wonderful human being, Katherine Adamenko is the manager of well-being for Ropes and Gray, which is a law firm I think they have multiple offices, but she is in the New York office. And she wears many hats for them. She is responsible for their well-being strategies. We'll talk more about the well-being and diversity initiative that she is doing with a colleague there, and many other things. And her background actually is not as a lawyer, but as as it says in her bio, veteran of the fitness and wellness industry. So we'll talk to her about that as well. Katherine, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a real honor to be here.
Well, we've had some great conversations offline, so excited and confident that this is going to be really interesting for our listeners. So Katherine, I want to just start out and ask you to describe what the manager of well-being, what your responsibilities are, what that actually means for a law firm, and then I'm sure I'll have some specific questions to ask you about that once we hear your initial description.
Sure. It's interesting. I think it's a little different for each of kind of the big law firms. It's been it's been fascinating to watch the kinds of people that and where they sit in a firm. Here at Ropes and Gray, I'm the first one of its kind as the manager of well-being, and the mission to bring me on was really about globalizing the well-being strategy. We have 6 offices in the US, we have 4 in Asia and 1 in the UK. And we had wonderful local wellness and well-being programs going on for a very long time, like over half a decade. Some of the races and challenges people had been running at the firm probably over a decade. But there was no cohesive overall strategy. And one of the most important reasons also why I was brought on in the middle of 2019 is we wanted to be part of the bigger lawyer well-being movement that really took off about a year prior throughout the legal industry. And so my
Was that
role,
sorry for interrupting, Katherine, but was that for the task force, the well-being task
yeah,
force, when that report
mhm.
came out? Mm-hmm.
Yep,
Okay.
that very industry changing report that came out, and then there
Mm-hmm.
were a number of public articles that came out talking about the mental health, like the crisis of mental health and well-being in the industry. So it was a real moment of intervention, and we wanted to be a leader. And so that's how Ropes found me, and I found Ropes. And I one of the other reasons that I was brought on is that I come, as you mentioned, I come from the fitness and wellness industries, but at the time I'd spent 7 solid years in well-being programming, really helping to build programs from the ground up.
Yeah, and it was with, I think, American Express was one of the companies you worked for. So that's not a small responsibility there to be the to be responsible for wellness for such a large company as American Express.
I really got my experience at Ascena Retail and Dress Barn.
Ah, okay. I've heard
So
of
that
Dress
was
Barn.
really,
That's a big company as well, right?
yeah, no longer, unfortunately, but
Ah,
one of the best places, culturally, one of the best places I've ever worked, for sure.
hmm
They had
hmm
a real commitment, and it was pretty groundbreaking. This was back in 2012.
It's a real commitment to well-being, you mean?
Yeah, it was a vision for
hmm
the vice president of HR at the time, was really committed
Hmm.
to bringing at the time, the company itself kind of into the well-being world.
So how did a law firm find you since you were not a former lawyer or you didn't work in law firms? How did that
Hmm.
happen?
LinkedIn. It's a good
Ah,
promo for
okay.
it's a good promo for LinkedIn.
All right. Wow. So just you just thought, and well, I guess I'll ask you then. What? Okay, they found you, but then what did you think? How did you imagine that going to a law firm would work for you since you
Mhm.
hadn't had any experience working at law firms?
Yeah, it was really fascinating. I had also been recruited by another law firm for a very similar role and had already gone through the whole interview process. So it was a little bit familiar as well. But what really did it is not calling, it's making the shift from wellness to well-being. And that's slowly
hmm
happening. And even in 2019, companies and corporations weren't quite there yet. And it was very specific of the shift from wellness to well-being that piqued my interest. Then I was believe it or not, so it's an interesting evolution. So that was one thing, and then the
And what's the
article.
difference, by the way, between
Sure.
wellness
So,
and
yep.
well-being?
So wellness tends to be on the physical health side of
hmm
things, right?
hmm
You can see
Right.
that you look at health and wellness centers. It's around lifestyle coaching, eating. I always like to use eating well, moving more, sleeping soundly, right? And stressing less.
Yeah.
And things, traditional wellness programs were things like flu shots and mammograms and a nutritional lunch and learn and maybe a step challenge. But the piece that was separate in particular was the mental health and emotional well being, as well as things on the more HR side of things like social community involvement, social well being,
hmm
career well being, financial well being. And so it's a much more holistic approach.
Yeah, it's kind of like, and folks, this is audio, so I can't show this to you, but like the graph that they have, or the graphic that they have
Hmm.
in the wellness report of the 6 different areas that define thriving, and
Hmm.
you mentioned a few of them right there. Um, so I took you away from I interrupted you in
Yeah.
talking about going
Yeah.
from wellness to well-being. I think we
Hmm.
were talking about how you envisioned yourself working for a law firm.
Yeah. And so, I already have like some of that experience under my belt of interviewing at another big law firm,
hmm
and a little bit understanding a little bit more of what it would encompass at a firm. But then I did a little digging around, and two things happened. It's just kind of like coincidental. The first was I did a little research on the lawyer well-being report itself and saw that one of its architects, Anne Bradford, was a graduate
Mm-hmm.
of the positive psychology program at UPenn under Martin
Mm-hmm.
Seligman. And I had been
Right.
spending the last 10 years as my personal project, personal passion project, researching positive psychology and reading everything I could and doing all the practices and
Wow.
learning all about it. So it was already grounded
Mm-hmm.
in philosophy and practice that I was not only passionate about, but was doing myself. And then
Did
it
you?
was,
Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry.
oh no, go ahead.
No, finish, Catherine.
And then the other piece is I was at a Passover family dinner, and I was sharing that I had this upcoming interview with a cousin who is a lawyer in big law at another firm. Um, and she had just shared the article that had come out of Big Law Killed My Husband. Um,
Oh, yes,
yeah,
yes.
which had
Was
a
that the Sidley Austin
yes,
lawyer?
it had
Mm-hmm.
a profound impact on me.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, and she shared, we had a very frank conversation, and she shared a little bit more kind of the life of a lawyer. And so between that, and then of course when I interviewed at Ropes and Gray, I also did a little right before the interview, I did research about their pro bono program, and they support so much of the organizations.
Mm-hmm.
They did work for around LGBTQ, immigration, social justice, like like a
Wow.
heavy duty work. And I started putting the pieces together. And I'm like, where can I serve? What, in a way that I could bring my own philosophy that's going to be welcome in the lawyer well-being world. And then of course the culture was the right fit.
Yeah, that's so important. And just to go off on a slight tangent, but in my role as a lawyer assistance program counselor, I often will talk to lawyers who aren't happy in their, not often, but it's not unusual to talk to lawyers who are unhappy in their current role, not as being lawyers necessarily, but either in the law firm or the organization um, where they're working. And I often talk with them about how important the values fit is. And if you don't have, and for some of them, there's a disconnect. Their values, I'm not saying that where the place where they're working is unethical or somehow a bad place in general, but for that person, there's a disconnect.
Mm-hmm.
And it sounds like for you, that was one of the draws for you with Ropes Gray was that there was a values connect, that it was
Mm-hmm.
consistent. What they were doing was consistent with some of your values.
Yeah, exactly.
Hmm. Okay. Um, so I'm curious, was there any difficulty for you not being a lawyer once you started working there? Did that present any obstacles for you? Because that can be for, sometimes lawyers can be, if you're not a lawyer, you don't understand my world. I've noticed that I do a lot of, Chris and I do a lot of CLE programs. Unfortunately, I'm a former lawyer, so that helps. But not being a lawyer sometimes it can take a little while for lawyers to warm up to you if you're presenting
Mhm.
CLE. Was that an obstacle for you at all?
It was, yes. I'll say my first 6 months, yes. And I'll share something really interesting of how I
Sure.
overcame it in two ways. The first is I was really fortunate myself because of my fitness training and also my training and as a wellness coach,
Hmm.
as a practitioner. I knew all about working with different personality types. I forget the four box, there's that four box theory, and that you could be like direct and social or
Hmm.
indirect, and so you get to know And I did a lot, like at Dress Barn, we did a lot of those kind of personality assessments. So I was already armed with a little bit more emotional intelligence coming
Yeah.
in. And believe it or not, even as a group fitness instructor, which I was a group fitness instructor for 10 years, I worked at some of the best clubs you could imagine. And we had some serious training about how to teach to all different personality types. So I transferred that knowledge of working with lawyers who are in like that top left box of like direct and informational. Like lawyers like to
Hmm.
be direct with armed with data and information. And I'm
Yes.
the
Yes.
opposite box. Draw the opposite diagonal line.
Right. Yeah.
Um so that was one thing. I came in with it. However, having the knowledge is different than the practice, but I was coached by my director,
Hmm.
and there were some difficult conversations. Some of it was a little bit more lighthearted, like I'm in the middle of a presentation to two leaders, and they stopped on like the second slide and pointed out I was missing a colon or a period or something. And then I was
That's
told I
funny.
need to get used to it. And so I upped my editing skills.
Right. That's funny.
And then the other type is also, learning how to be yourself, right? But also how to fit in a sense of what you're saying and what you do is going to get across. And that's something, again, that is part of my wellness,
Hmm.
my training as a wellness coach. But the other big piece of how I also overcame the obstacle, I started finding avenues where my personality really could shine through in things like teaching and teaching yoga
Hmm.
classes and giving practical presentations, where those are the most important skills. So I had to really practice some of the kind of more harder skills, maybe toning it down at meetings and listening more, and being a little bit more formal, and then
Hmm.
using that the my strengths kind of in my own personality wheelhouse to do the things that like a wellnessy person does.
Yeah, that's a good point. I remember I did some consulting and worked with some high level corporate leaders for a company, and I wasn't doing it myself. I was doing it with a team of folks, and I am such a informal, pretty laid back person.
What?
And
No, I
yeah,
didn't
I
get
know
that
that's
at
shocking.
all.
I know you're shocked by that. So that was one of my challenges, actually, to go into that setting and be more formal. I couldn't just go in and be, they say be yourself, which is true. You don't want to change who you are, but I had to go in and be more formal, and it was a real
Mhm.
challenge for me to. And it sounded like for you that's, I think what you said is you didn't change who you were, of course, because who you are is so important in your role. You're very vivacious and high energy and passionate, and that's so important. And you needed to modulate that at times, depending on who
Mhm.
you were in front of, right?
I think everybody does. Like, I think that's part of what
Mm-hmm.
emotional intelligence is all about.
Mm-hmm.
I was
Mm-hmm.
just on a bigger learning curve, and then also, excuse me. Also, I was coming into a global role for the first time, a true
Mm-hmm.
global role with some big expectations and like programming already set to go. I was kind of
Yeah.
thrown into the fire
Yeah.
as well. And so I had a newer role. And even though I was a manager already a program manager for many years, being a manager at Ropes and Gray was at a bit of a different level. Like out in the real world, it would have been like a senior level. So I
Mm-hmm.
really had to skill up in that sense of really owning it of
Yeah.
what a manager is. And there is a little bit more of an element of formality, but I also really appreciated it because I now have better listening skills
Mm-hmm.
outside of coaching, right? It's very different as a wellness coach, kind of like it's almost like the podcast you're doing now, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It's a little bit
Yeah.
different. Just with interactions, for example, at meetings, I've learned how to listen more, um, have more better crisp execution, meeting recaps, follow-ups, and I see when I don't do these things, there's a little bit of bleeding in there. And also, of course, you want to be taken seriously.
That's
So
right.
you don't want to be too loosey goosey. Like, it's interesting seeing the different vendor, like having, we've had some experts come in and seeing the ones who understand that a little
Hmm.
bit better than others and how they're received, right? And how they're talked about after.
So
And
how,
so
did
it's something. Oh, go ahead.
well, I was just going to ask you, as being a female, was that, and I know it was in a role as a wellness person, so maybe um, there's more expectation that's going to be a female in that role. But did you find that being a female was a challenge at all in terms of being uh, respected by some of the folks you worked with there, particularly those in leadership?
Oh God, no.
Not a
Oh
problem.
no, yeah, gender, yeah, ropes and there. It's interesting. It's not as much. It can look like the well-being and wellness can look like a woman's world, but it isn't, and it also isn't in law firms, right? Some of the leaders of the well-being leaders that are the firms are men as well. I welcome it because it can be a bit of a. I worked for many women in women's circles, especially
Right.
HR. But no, never had that impact at all.
Okay. Well, that's good to hear. So just personally, I want to ask you more of a personal question
Sure.
again. So it sounds like I'm anxious even hearing what it may have been like for you to jump into this job at a law firm. You've never worked at a law firm, and like you said, this is a global initiative that you jumped into. Um, how did you? How were you able to keep your feet on the ground, stay centered,
Mhm.
deal with stress, anxiety, the pressure? What worked for you back then?
Well, I'll tell you, anxiety got the best of me.
Hmm.
That was for
Okay.
sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, it really got the best of me. There's moments you think, did I get in over my head? It was a lot of it was
Hmm.
culturally. Do I fit in? Will I ever fit in?
Yeah.
Am I, is this something that, but the two things, there were three things that I did. The first was, I'd have these one-on-ones with my director, and she explained it that onboarding at Ropes is just, it's a place, one of the best law firms in the world with high expectations. And so you're going to have to learn more about those expectations. So you're going to climb up the hill and you're going to get to a plateau and you're going to be like, oh, I got it. I can do that. I get it. And then something, time's going to go on and there you are, boom, another big hill. And you're going to go up
Right.
that hill. And I've gone up a whole number of them, right? It's such a great feeling. So that was some of the best coaching that I got from my director as well. And then I sought help. I was going through this massive amount of anxiety I hadn't experienced in a really long time. So I got the help that I needed.
Hmm.
That was one thing. And
Yeah.
I really,
Yeah.
I saw, I had been seeing a therapist, but then I specifically focused around this and we did a lot of work around it. So I did a very focused kind of problem solving around it. And then a lot of self care. I did a lot of self care. My sleep was being disrupted. I was feeling a mess. And so I had to really make a concerted effort to really focus on sleep hygiene, all the habits around sleep, really take positive action. If I couldn't sleep, find it was a lot of like CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy techniques, right? About the ways in which I'm thinking and approaching my work, making sure I was eating well and relaxing and spending time with friends you know and then of course I had this big initiative that happened and it was a success. And then I'm like, what was all of that crazy worry about, right?
Yeah. Well, I actually repeat myself probably to clients and to folks in workshop audiences, but and maybe even have said this in one of the podcasts, but I'll say it again. One of my favorite quotes is Mark Twain's quote that hopefully I have right. He said, I've had many worries in my life. Most of them have never happened.
Mm, I
Yeah.
know.
So that's so true that most of the stuff we worry about doesn't happen.
Hmm.
But to just to highlight what you said, because I think this is really important for our listeners to hear, and this is something we hammer home on this podcast. In fact, it's called the Thriving Lawyers, plural, lawyers, not lawyer podcast, because our focus is on the importance of uh, well-being, of course, but the importance of community. And so you said, first thing you said was you had a mentor. Yeah, it was maybe this was your boss as well, but a mentor um, who you could go to, who could give you some guidance. And then you went to a therapist. So you had recruited two folks to help you. And
Hmm.
then self-care and sleep hygiene, as you said. And you mentioned cognitive behavioral, because you said when you first started answering the question, one of the negative thoughts you had was, I don't know if I can do this, or who am I to think I can do this? I don't know if you actually thought something like that, but similar kinds of thoughts, right? Have I taken on too much? And it's important that we respond to those thoughts. Now, of course, you had success, so now you have that to because if that negative thought comes back, you can look back at and you can identify the fact that you've had success now, and that's of course helpful.
Yeah.
Um, so what have you noticed? And did you answer that question fully? By the way, I
Yeah.
just want to make sure because
Yeah,
okay,
I
good.
think the only other thing that I will add as well is
Mm-hmm.
that there was a meeting, when I was going through this, because my performance, my boss would get calls, like I was making mistakes. When you get anxious, like you're not at 100%. So it wasn't just that I wasn't sleeping, I wasn't working at the capacity that, of course, that I knew myself to be as a professional, right? And
Mm-hmm.
then my boss looked at me and she's like, "What's wrong?" And without going into detail, and I think this is so important because nobody wants to talk about mental health at work, right? And I
Mm-hmm.
just finally looked at her and just said, "I have anxiety." And it was so great because
Mm-hmm.
I was role modeling,
Yep.
as a
Yep.
well-being
Yeah.
expert, and
Yeah.
here I
Exactly.
am as a coach. I spent thousands of sessions with folks openly talking about their struggles in not necessarily mental health because I'm not a counselor, but around struggles and
Mm-hmm.
obstacles and everything. And I opened my mouth, especially that I have anxiety, and I was like, wow, I just said it out loud. Like, it's very different to talk about it with your partner or your therapist, but it's very different to talk about it
Mm-hmm.
to your director. But then I said to her, I'm taking care of it. I'm working on it. And she goes, good. And that was it.
Yeah, and it was, but to the credit of your director, they asked, right?
Oh my God.
Um,
Yes. Yes. Yes.
yeah.
And remember, this is pre pandemic, but not, this was in November, I believe, of 2019, right? So,
Mm-hmm.
I can
Mm-hmm.
only think now how much easier it is, or hopefully easier it is for leaders to reach out, to ask that question.
You're talking about during. I was going to say post pandemic, but that's not true,
No,
and
yeah,
it won't be true when this podcast drops. You're talking
no,
about you're talking about now during the pandemic.
yeah.
It's easier. It's maybe become more normalized to check in with folks and see how they're doing.
Yeah, it was part of what we were giving leaders guidance on. It was the check-in. It was literally a
Mm-hmm.
check-in, making sure
Mm-hmm.
they're checking in with their
Mm-hmm.
people. And,
Mm-hmm.
as we kind of return to the office, it's still part of that. It doesn't matter. Now it could even be more impactful if it's in person, right? So interesting.
Yeah. Yeah,
I mean,
and
maybe I'm sorry. I was going to say maybe
yeah, sure.
I'm going to qualify that because if there's one thing that works virtually, it's been video therapy or like video check-ins.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So I'm going to
Mm-hmm.
qualify that. I think that's the one area, whether you can check in with someone face to face or virtually with a camera. I'm going to make sure I qualify
You're
that.
saying that's still effective to check in
Totally. Yeah, it's
virtually.
still
Yeah,
effective.
I agree. All my counseling sessions since the beginning of COVID, I haven't done one in the room counseling session. They've all been either virtual or on the phone,
Yeah.
and they're very effective. This is not a podcast to talk about the downsides of that, but there's certainly downsides. But they can be as effective as in the room. Um, so and I want to just emphasize one other thing: the fact that I think you said I'm anxious out loud, and how much that helps just to say it out loud to someone. And in this case, someone you work for, which took, granted you were modeling something, but it still took some courage on your part to say it out loud. But it can be so relieving to first identify it and name it, but then to say it out loud to someone.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Thriving Lawyers Podcast. We love hearing from our loyal listeners, so please feel free to email us any questions, comments, suggested topics, or guest recommendations at the following address: feedback@thrivinglawyerspodcast.com. The Thriving Lawyers Podcast is brought to you by Real-Time Creative Learning Experiences, a national provider of continuing legal education and professional development programs that leave participants engaged, encouraged, and equipped to pursue meaningful and sustainable change in their practices, their lives, and the organizations they work in. And by Osborne Conflict Resolution, your experienced guides through the uncharted terrain of business and family law disputes, based out of Charlotte, North Carolina. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time on the Thriving Lawyers Podcast.